Keep your hands on the dash, or I will shoot you dead." Officer Tiffany shrieked, her service pistol trembling violently as she aimed it at the driver's head. Oliver Lewis, a decorated black Navy SEAL, didn't break eye contact. He kept his large, empty hands perfectly still. "Officer, I am unarmed. My military identification is in my left pocket. I am completely compliant. I don't care about your fake ID, boy," she spat, her eyes wide with irrational, hateful fury. "You step out of that damn pickup truck right now." The midnight air of the coastal city hung heavy and humid, smelling faintly of salt and impending rain. Oliver Lewis drove his meticulously maintained, decade-old pickup truck down the desolate stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. He was a man composed of quiet disciplines, his posture impeccably straight even after a grueling 20-hour transit back from an undisclosed forward operating base. As a Navy SEAL, Oliver was accustomed to high-threat environments, but tonight, all he wanted was the soft mattress of his civilian apartment and the deafening silence of a world not at war. The abrupt, blinding flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror shattered the tranquility. The siren gave a sharp, aggressive wail, a demand, not a request. Oliver's heart rate barely ticked upward. His training dictated an immediate, calculated response to unexpected stimuli. He checked his mirrors, engaged his turn signal, and pulled smoothly onto the gravel shoulder, ensuring there was ample room for the approaching officers to stand safely away from the meager flow of late-night traffic. He shifted the truck into park, killed the engine, and rolled down all four windows, resting his large, calloused hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. He knew the statistics. He knew exactly what he looked like to certain people in the dark. In the rearview mirror, he watched two figures approach. The lead officer, a woman with blonde hair pulled into a severe, tight bun, approached with a predator's stride. This was Officer Tiffany. Her hand was already resting menacingly on the butt of her service weapon, her posture radiating an unwarranted hostility that Oliver immediately clocked as dangerous. Trailing a few paces behind her, looking distinctly uncomfortable, was her partner, Officer Frank. Frank's eyes darted around, his body language speaking volumes of a man merely following a volatile leader out of cowardly obligation. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Tiffany barked before she even reached the window, her flashlight blindingly trained directly into Oliver's retinas. Oliver blinked slowly, keeping his voice modulated to a deep, soothing baritone. "Good evening, officer. My wallet is in the center console. I need to take my right hand off the steering wheel to retrieve it. Is that acceptable to you?" Tiffany's jaw tightened. She didn't like the calm. She didn't like that he wasn't intimidated. "I said, give me your ID. Don't play games with me, boy." The word hung in the air, thick and rancid. Boy. Oliver, a 32-year-old chief petty officer who had led men through hellfire, felt a cold, familiar spike of societal reality pierce his armor. But discipline held firm. "I am complying, officer," Oliver said, moving his right hand with exaggerated slowness toward the console. "He's reaching." Tiffany shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. In a fluid, terrifyingly reckless motion, she drew her firearm and leveled it at Oliver's temple. "Show me your hands. Show me your hands right now." "My hands are visible," Oliver said, immediately raising both hands to the roof of the cab, his palms open. "I have no weapons. My military identification is in my left breast pocket." "Shut up, open the door from the outside, and step out." Slowly, she commanded, her gun trembling slightly. Behind her, Frank finally found a sliver of voice. "Tiff, he's got his hands up. Maybe we just—" "Back off, Frank. I've got this." Tiffany snapped, never taking her eyes off Oliver. Out of the car, Oliver reached out the window, unlatched the door, and stepped out into the humid night air. He towered over Tiffany, a mountain of solid, conditioned muscle, yet he kept his posture subservient, his shoulders rounded, hands high. "Turn around and face the truck," she ordered. As Oliver complied, Tiffany stepped forward and viciously kicked his boots apart, far wider than necessary, nearly hyperextending his knees. "Hands behind your back." As Oliver lowered his hands to comply, Tiffany unclipped her taser with her left hand while holstering her firearm. Without warning, without a secondary command, and without an ounce of justification, she drove the prongs directly into the center of Oliver's back and pulled the trigger. 50,000 volts of electricity tore through Oliver's nervous system. The pain was absolute, a blinding white fire that turned his muscles to stone. He collapsed against the side of his truck, his head striking the quarter panel with a sickening thud. He hit the gravel, his body seizing, but through the agony, his SEAL training engaged. Breathe. Control the panic. Survive. Tiffany stood over him, panting, a twisted look of satisfaction mingling with her faux terror. Stop resisting, she yelled to the empty street, creating a narrative for her body camera. Across the street, obscured by the shadows of a defunct gas station, sat a battered Honda Civic. Inside, a young nursing student named Stanley was frozen in horror. His phone, however, was already recording, the lens pressed against the slightly lowered window, capturing the violence, the unprovoked strike, and the terrifying reality of power unchecked. The holding cell at the 43rd Precinct smelled of ammonia, stale sweat, and institutional despair. Oliver sat perfectly still on the center of the steel bench, his back rigid, his breathing rhythmic and deep. A painful welt had formed on his cheekbone where he had struck his truck, and his muscles still twitched intermittently from the aftershocks of the taser. His wrists, chafed raw from the unnecessarily tight zip ties Tiffany had employed, throbbed with a dull ache. He closed his eyes and mentally transported himself to the icy waters of Coronado. He remembered the cold, the exhaustion, the instructors screaming in his face to quit. He hadn't quit then, and he certainly wasn't going to break now. The physical pain was negligible compared to the profound, hollow ache in his chest. He had dedicated his life to defending the Constitution of the United States, yet the very uniform he wore beneath his skin afforded him no protection on the streets of the country he served. The heavy steel door clanked open, interrupting his meditation. In walked Chief Rebecca. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that contrasted sharply with the grime of the holding area. She radiated an aura of political survival. Rebecca didn't care about justice. She cared about optics, pensions, and minimizing precinct liabilities. She pulled up a metal folding chair and sat across from Oliver, offering a small, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Lewis, or should I say, Chief Petty Officer Lewis," Rebecca began, her tone gentle, almost maternal. "I've just reviewed the preliminary reports from tonight's incident." Oliver opened his eyes and leveled a stare at her that had silenced warlords. He said nothing. "Look, Oliver," Rebecca sighed, crossing her legs. "It seems there was a massive miscommunication out there on the highway. Officer Tiffany is a highly decorated patrolwoman, but she's been under a lot of stress lately. The department is stretched thin. You know how it is, being in a high-stress job yourself. I know that when my men make a mistake under stress, people die," Oliver said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate the steel walls. "And I know that what happened tonight was not a miscommunication. It was an unprovoked assault." Rebecca's smile tightened slightly. "Now, let's not use inflammatory language. The report states you were non-compliant and made sudden movements toward your console. The report is a fabrication. Be that as it may," Rebecca pressed on, leaning forward. "This could get very messy for everyone. A resisting arrest charge, assaulting an officer, that could ruin a military career. It would be a shame to see your service record tarnished over a traffic stop gone awry. So, here is what I'm prepared to do. I'm prepared to drop all charges. We open the door, you walk out of here tonight, free and clear." She slid a single piece of paper across the small metal table between them. "All you have to do is sign this standard waiver of liability, stating you will not pursue civil or criminal action against the department or the officers involved. We both walk away. A clean slate." Oliver looked at the paper. It was a golden ticket out of a cage, offered by the devil herself. He looked back at Rebecca. He saw the subtle tremor in her hand, the slight sheen of sweat on her forehead. She was terrified. She hadn't seen the body cam footage yet, but she knew her officer's history. She was trying to cap a volcano before it erupted. "Chief," Oliver said, slowly pushing the paper back across the table with one heavily bruised finger. I have sworn an oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Tonight, I met a domestic one. I will not sign your paper. I will not walk away. I want my phone call. Rebecca's mask of maternal concern vanished, replaced by a hardened, vicious glare. You're making a massive mistake, sailor. You think because you have a fancy title, you can take on the blue wall? We will bury you. Dig deep, Chief, Oliver replied softly. Because I'm bringing in a bulldozer. 10 minutes later, standing at the wall-mounted precinct phone, Oliver dialed a number he had memorized for emergencies. Scarlett and Associates. A crisp voice answered. Scarlett, it's Oliver. I need you. Scarlett did not walk into rooms. She seized them. At 3:00 a.m., the lobby of the 43rd Precinct was a quiet sanctuary of bored desk sergeants and buzzing fluorescent lights until the heavy glass doors violently swung open. Scarlett stepped through, flanked by a paralegal carrying a reinforced briefcase. She wore a pristine white trench coat over a sharp black suit, her stilettos clicking against the linoleum like a metronome counting down to an execution. She was the most feared civil rights attorney on the West Coast, known for eviscerating corrupt police departments with surgical precision. She marched straight to the front desk, bypassing the queue line. I am here to see my client, Oliver Lewis. He is currently being held unlawfully without charge, Scarlett stated, her voice projecting across the room, carrying the absolute authority of the law. Officer Frank, who had been hiding on desk duty since the incident, went pale. Ma'am, visiting hours are. Do not quote precinct policy to me, officer, Scarlett interrupted, her eyes locking onto his name tag. Officer Frank, were you the secondary on the scene of my client's assault tonight? Never mind. Do not answer that without union representation. You are going to go into the back, find whoever is in charge of this circus, and tell them that Scarlett Hayes is standing in their lobby. And if I do not see my client in 3 minutes, I am filing a writ of habeas corpus, a federal civil rights lawsuit, and personal complaints against every officer who has touched his paperwork. While Scarlett was dismantling the precinct's front desk, a different kind of storm was brewing in a small, cramped apartment across town. Stanley sat illuminated by the harsh glow of his laptop monitor. His hands were shaking. He had watched the video he recorded on his phone a dozen times. In crisp, undeniable high definition, it showed the entire encounter. It captured Oliver's calm demeanor, his raised hands, and the sudden, brutal deployment of the taser. Most damning of all, as Oliver fell, his wallet had slipped from his pocket. The video clearly showed Oliver's military ID sliding across the asphalt, stopping at Tiffany's boots. The camera caught her glancing down at it, sneering, and deliberately kicking it into the storm drain before screaming, "Stop resisting." Stanley knew the risks. He was a young black man in a city with a notorious police department. Putting a target on his back by exposing one of their own was dangerous. He hovered his mouse cursor over the publish button on 3 different social media platforms. He thought about his own brother, his father. He thought about the stoic man in the video who had absorbed the voltage without a cry. Do what's right, Stanley whispered to the empty room. He clicked. The video uploaded. At first, it was a trickle. 10 views, 50. Then, a prominent civil rights activist in Atlanta retweeted it. A major news anchor, awake early for the morning broadcast, shared it on a global platform. The algorithm, sensing the visceral outrage and undeniable injustice of the footage, poured gasoline on the spark. Back at the precinct, Officer Tiffany was sitting in the break room, nursing a cup of stale coffee. She was bragging to a couple of night shift rookies about putting another thug in his place, spinning a wild tale of Oliver violently resisting. Suddenly, the phone in her pocket buzzed. Then it pinged. Then it began to vibrate continuously, like a trapped wasp. She pulled it out, annoyed. It was a text from Frank. Tiff, go to Twitter, now. Look at the trending. Frowning, she opened the app. The #1 trending hashtag worldwide, with over 400,000 tweets in the last hour, was staring back at her. Number Justice for Oliver. Number Racist Cop Attack Seal. Her breath hitched. She clicked the top video. Her own voice, shrill and panicked, played through the tiny speaker of her phone. "Show me your hands." She watched herself tase a compliant, decorated military veteran. She watched herself kick his ID into the drain. The internet had already found her name, her badge number, and her precinct. Tiffany dropped her phone on the linoleum floor. The screen cracked, a spider web of shattered glass mirroring the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her reality. The blue wall she had hidden behind her entire career was about to be pulverized. The morning sun broke over the coastal city, its light struggling to pierce the thick layer of marine fog, casting long, accusing shadows across the brutalist concrete steps of the 43rd Precinct. By 7:00 a.m., the normally quiet, industrial street was completely impassable. A barricade of satellite trucks, humming news vans with extended antennas, and hundreds of outraged citizens had choked the thoroughfare. The rhythmic, deafening chant of "no justice, no peace" rattled the precinct's bulletproof glass windows. The viral video had done far more than spark temporary internet outrage. It had ignited a deep, historical powder keg of community frustration, racial grievance, and unchecked police brutality. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating, smelling of stale coffee and suppressed panic. Officer Tiffany paced the narrow confines of the union representative's small, windowless office like a trapped, feral animal. Her blonde hair, normally pulled into a pristine, intimidating bun, was fraying wildly at the edges, mirroring her rapidly unraveling sanity. She still wore her navy blue uniform, but without her heavy leather gun belt, her taser, and her silver shield, all confiscated hours ago by the solemn-faced detectives of internal affairs. She looked remarkably small, stripped of the power she had so ruthlessly abused. "You need to stop pacing, sit down, and listen to me," barked Mike, a seasoned, heavy-set union lawyer with a permanent, deep-set scowl and a tie loosened around his thick neck. He sat behind his cluttered desk, aggressively massaging his temples as his cell phone vibrated endlessly, a continuous stream of disasters demanding his attention. "The chief has placed you on administrative leave with pay. That is standard protocol. We fought for that clause. But you need to comprehend the absolute gravity of the hurricane outside those doors. The mayor's office has called the precinct commander 3 times since dawn. The governor just tweeted about the video. The NAACP is mobilizing. They don't know the whole story," Tiffany shrieked, slamming her palms down hard on Mike's wooden desk, her eyes wide and manic. "He was non-compliant, Mike. He's a huge guy, a freaking giant. You saw him on the tape. He was reaching for the center console. I couldn't see his hands. I feared for my life. That's my right." Mike looked up slowly, his pale eyes entirely devoid of sympathy. He sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. "Tiffany, I have watched the video 20 times. Internal Affairs has watched it 50. The entire world has watched it." The man moved at the speed of a dying glacier. He politely narrated his exact movements. He had his hands up, fingers spread. "And the worst part? The absolute nail in your legal coffin?" Mike leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You kicked his military ID into the storm sewer. You sneered while you did it. Do you have any idea how that plays to a jury pool in a town with a massive naval base? You didn't just tase an unarmed black man. You tased an active-duty Navy SEAL in his uniform pants and threw his service record in the garbage. You are radioactive." Tiffany sank into a cheap, cracked leather guest chair, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Reality was beginning to penetrate her delusion. "Frank will back me up," she stammered, clutching at straws. Frank knows how tense it was. He felt the danger. He was right there. Frank is currently sitting 3 doors down with a federal internal affairs investigator and the FBI, and I strongly advised him to secure his own outside counsel, Mike said grimly, packing his briefcase. "Do not contact him. Do not post a single syllable on social media. Go home, pull your blinds down, lock your doors, and pray this insatiable news cycle finds a new tragedy by tomorrow. Because right now, you are the villain of the week." While Tiffany was being scolded into a terrified silence, Oliver Lewis was walking out the heavy glass front doors of the precinct. He moved with the same disciplined, measured stride he used on the battlefield, his posture impeccable despite the physical trauma of the night. He was flanked by Scarlett Hayes and her elite team of paralegals. Scarlett wore a blood-red designer suit today, a deliberate, aggressive sartorial choice that practically dared the press to challenge her. She looked less like a lawyer and more like a general leading a conquering army. As they stepped into the harsh daylight, a deafening roar of camera shutters, flashing strobes, and shouted questions washed over them like a tidal wave. "Chief Lewis, are you pressing criminal charges?" "Scarlett, what is the Department of the Navy's official stance on the assault?" Did the officer use racial slurs before the camera started rolling? Oliver's face was an unreadable stoic mask. The swelling on his cheekbone was purpling violently, a stark visual testament to the night's unprovoked violence. Yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that silenced the front row of reporters. Scarlett stepped up to a cluster of microphones, raising one elegantly manicured hand. The crowd instantly quieted, recognizing the absolute authority of an apex predator about to strike. "My client, Chief Petty Officer Oliver Lewis, is a highly decorated servant of this nation. He has shed blood to defend the freedoms of the very people who assaulted him," Scarlett announced, her voice ringing clear, sharp, and perfectly modulated over the rumble of morning traffic. Last night, while driving home to his family, he was subjected to a brutal, unprovoked, and overtly racially motivated assault by those sworn to protect him. "We are not standing here today to ask for apologies. Apologies do not cure the systemic rot that has clearly infested the 43rd Precinct. Apologies do not rewrite the culture of violence." She paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the air. "We are here to demand absolute, uncompromising accountability. Later today, my firm will be filing a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Tiffany Vance, Police Chief Rebecca Thorne, and the city itself. Furthermore, we are formally calling upon the Department of Justice to launch an immediate, independent investigation into the persistent deprivation of constitutional rights under the color of law at this precinct." She turned, placing a light, protective hand on Oliver's massive arm, and guided him toward a waiting, blacked-out SUV. Oliver didn't say a single word, but as he slid into the backseat, his dark eyes caught the lens of a prominent network news camera. His stare was cold, resolved, and entirely unwavering. It was the terrifying, calculated look of a Tier 1 operator who had identified his target and was simply waiting for the perfect, sanctioned moment to pull the trigger. Across town, in a small, cramped, unair-conditioned apartment that smelled faintly of instant ramen, Stanley sat on the edge of his unmade bed, watching the live press conference on his cracked laptop screen. His phone had not stopped vibrating since 5:00 a.m. Somehow, internet sleuths had traced the original video upload back to his burner account, cross-referencing his reflection in the car window. His inbox was a war zone. Some messages called him a national hero, offering him money and praise. Others vile, anonymous, expletive-laden threats called him a snitch, promised violent retribution, and listed his home address. Stanley felt a cold, hard knot of fear twist in his stomach. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the hate. But as he looked up and watched Oliver's stoic, bruised face on the screen, the paralyzing fear was slowly replaced by a profound, warming sense of purpose. He was a nursing student. His life was dedicated to preserving human life and alleviating suffering. Last night, he had preserved the truth. He closed his laptop with a decisive snap, took a deep, steadying breath, and prepared to face whatever storm he had just summoned. The interior of the interrogation room at police headquarters was painted a sickening, institutional shade of mint green, designed to calm suspects but usually succeeding only in making them nauseous. Officer Frank sat rigidly at the dented metal table, his uniform shirt stained dark with nervous sweat at the armpits and collar. The air conditioning was conveniently broken, or perhaps deliberately turned off, and the small, heavily soundproofed room felt like a pressure cooker, slowly building toward an explosion. Across from him sat two formidable figures. One was a seasoned, cynical investigator from internal affairs, tapping a pen rhythmically against a notepad. The other was a quiet, intensely focused man in an immaculate gray suit who had introduced himself simply as Agent Miller from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. Scarlett's fiery press conference had worked with terrifying speed, The feds were officially in the building, and they weren't playing local politics. "Let's go over the timeline one more time, Officer Frank." From the moment the sirens were activated, Agent Miller said, his voice softer than the hum of the dying fluorescent lights overhead. It was a voice that commanded absolute truth. He slowly pushed an iPad across the scarred metal table. It was paused on the viral video, zoomed in on the exact fraction of a second before Tiffany drew her weapon. Officer Tiffany claims in her preliminary report that Mr. Lewis made a sudden, aggressive, and unpredictable lunge toward the center console, prompting her to draw her service firearm in immediate fear for her life. "Is that your sworn recollection of the event?" Frank swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. He stared at the screen. He thought about the thin blue line. He thought about the unwritten, sacred rule of the brotherhood that you never, ever turn on your partner, no matter the sin. But then he looked up at the golden federal badge resting ominously on the table. He thought about the very real, life-destroying threat of federal perjury charges. And mostly, he thought about the agonizing image of Oliver Lewis calm, deeply respectful, and completely defenseless, absorbing 50,000 volts of electricity while simply trying to go home. Frank looked back down at the paused frame. He saw Tiffany's face clearly. It wasn't contorted in fear. He knew what fear looked like. Her face was twisted in a hateful, irrational rage. He remembered the sickening, hollow thud of Oliver's skull hitting the steel of the truck. He remembered his own cowardice in failing to stop her. "No," Frank whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. "I'm sorry, officer, the microphone didn't catch that." "You'll need to speak up," the IA investigator said, leaning in like a shark sensing blood in the water. Frank closed his eyes tightly. A single tear, a mixture of profound shame and overwhelming relief, escaped and tracked down his cheek. "No, that is not my recollection. The report is false, Mr. Lewis was entirely compliant. He asked for explicit permission to reach for his wallet. He moved incredibly slowly. Tiffany. She just snapped. I don't know why, but she was deeply aggressive from the very moment she stepped out of the cruiser. She escalated the situation immediately. He never posed a threat. Not for a single, solitary second. Agent Miller nodded slowly, his expression unchanging, making a brief, meticulous note on his legal pad. And the taser deployment? Was there a struggle we cannot see on the footage? Unprovoked, Frank said, the word feeling like a massive, suffocating weight finally leaving his chest. He looked Agent Miller in the eye. There was no warning. There was no physical resistance. He was complying with her order to put his hands behind his back. She just shot him in the spine. 3 floors above the suffocating interrogation room, Chief Rebecca Thorne was standing in her spacious, air-conditioned office. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the massive, surging crowd of protesters below. The crowd had doubled in size since the morning, spilling into the adjacent streets, holding up traffic for miles. The city was on the brink of a riot. Her private desk phone rang the unlisted line. It was the IA investigator. "Chief," the voice said, flat and clinical. Frank just flipped. Full, unredacted confession. He completely corroborated the victim's narrative and admitted the initial report was falsified. The FBI is taking lead on a criminal civil rights investigation. They're preparing warrants. Rebecca slowly closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The blue wall hadn't just cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. She had spent 30 grueling years navigating the treacherous, male-dominated politics of the police department, building her pristine reputation, securing her gold-plated pension, and cementing her legacy as a reformer. She was absolutely not going to let a hot-headed, bigoted patrolwoman drag her down into a federal indictment abyss. Her political survival mode engaged instantly. She walked briskly over to her heavy mahogany desk, sat down, and opened a crisp, official department letterhead document on her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with ruthless, practiced efficiency. Egregious violation of departmental policy regarding use of force. Conduct unbecoming of a sworn officer. Willful and malicious falsification of official police reports. She printed the document, picked up her favorite heavy fountain pen, and signed it with a definitive, slashing stroke. She slammed her hand down on the intercom button, Get me the press liaison in here right now. I want a statement drafted and blasted to every media outlet in the state. Officer Tiffany Vance is to be terminated, effective immediately, stripped of her badge, her gun, and all police powers. Tell the district attorney's office that this department will fully and enthusiastically cooperate with any and all criminal indictments brought against her. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. She knew Scarlett Hayes would still come for her, would still file the massive civil lawsuit to bleed the city dry. But she had to brutally amputate the infected limb to save the body. Tiffany was no longer a police officer. She was a disposable liability, thrown to the wolves to buy the department time. Tiffany sat alone in the stifling darkness of her suburban living room, the curtains drawn tight, the only illumination coming from the harsh, flickering glow of the muted television screen. It was 9 p.m. Barely 24 hours had passed since she had confidently pulled Oliver Lewis over on the highway, feeling like a god of the asphalt, but her entire universe had completely collapsed. The news chyrons crawling relentlessly across the bottom of the screen were a continuous, agonizing assault on her reality. Officer fired in brutal viral Tase incident. FBI opens federal civil rights probe. Decorated Navy SEAL sues city for $50 million. Community demands arrest. Her smartphone lay face down on the glass coffee table, completely silent. The police union president had called her over an hour ago to coldly inform her that, due to her immediate termination and the severe nature of the impending federal charges, they were permanently withdrawing their legal representation. She was entirely on her own. Her so-called friends on the force, the ones who had cheered her aggressive tactics in the locker room, weren't answering her frantic texts or calls. She had become instantly radioactive, a pariah in the only community she had ever known. Suddenly, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet house. It wasn't the polite, hesitant tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was the rhythmic, booming, wall-shaking knock of law enforcement executing a warrant. Tiffany froze, her blood running cold. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a terrifying, genuine mimicry of the panic she had falsely claimed the night before. She stood up on trembling legs, walking slowly, almost mechanically, to the front door and peered through the brass peephole. 3 large men in dark tactical windbreakers with bold, bright yellow letters, reading FBI, stood on her front porch. Behind them, a local police cruiser, driven by her own former colleagues, sat idling quietly in the street, its lights off, strategically positioned to ensure she didn't try to run out the back. She unlocked the deadbolt with shaking hands, the door swinging open to reveal the grim reality of her future. "Tiffany Vance?" the lead agent asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, reading her name off a clipboard. "Yes," she squeaked, her voice failing her, her throat tightening in absolute terror. "You are under arrest for the federal deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and falsifying a police report. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." As the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked definitively around her wrists, biting into her skin, the harsh, inescapable reality of her actions finally crushed her. She was marched out of her house, down her manicured front walk, right past her neighbors who stood on their lawns in their bathrobes, watching in silent, condemning judgment. She was shoved roughly into the cramped back seat of a federal vehicle, the heavy doors slamming shut with a terrifying finality that sealed her fate. Miles away, in a quiet, warmly lit, old-school diner on the far edge of the city, Oliver Lewis sat in a worn vinyl booth, nursing a ceramic cup of black, bitter coffee. The bell above the glass door chimed brightly, and Stanley walked in. The young nursing student looked exhausted and incredibly nervous, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. Oliver immediately stood up. He didn't offer a formal handshake. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled the young man into a firm, brief, brotherly embrace. "Sit down, Stanley," Oliver said, his deep baritone voice thick with genuine emotion and respect. "I ordered you a double cheeseburger and fries. Figured you hadn't eaten much today with the circus going on." Stanley slid cautiously into the booth, looking in awe at the formidable, highly trained soldier across from him. "Chief Lewis, I just wanted to say I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Nobody deserves that, especially not someone who serves." Oliver, call me Oliver, he replied softly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. And you have absolutely nothing to be sorry for. In my line of work, in the teams, we talk a lot about courage under fire. We train for it endlessly. We expect it from each other in combat. But what you did last night, sitting alone in your car, knowing the danger of confronting armed police in the dark, and choosing to roll down your window and record anyway? That is true, rare courage, Stanley. You didn't just save my career from being ruined by a lie. You saved my life. And you exposed a rot in this city that desperately needed to be cut out. It's been crazy, Stanley admitted, staring down at the laminated table, his shoulders slumping with fatigue. I've gotten death threats online, people finding my address, telling me to watch my back. I'm just trying to finish nursing school, man. Oliver's eyes instantly hardened, a brief, chilling flash of the lethal operator surfacing beneath his calm exterior. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slid a heavy, matte black business card across the table. It had a single phone number printed on it, no name. I have brothers who are no longer in uniform, men who do high-level private security now, Oliver said, his voice dropping to a serious, unwavering register. They are watching your apartment building as we speak. They will shadow you to your classes. They will ensure you finish nursing school and walk across that stage without a single hair on your head being harmed. That is my personal promise to you. You are under my protection now. Stanley looked at the card, a massive, overwhelming wave of profound relief washing over him, bringing tears to his eyes. Thank you, Oliver. I don't know what to say. No, Oliver said softly, looking out the diner window into the dark, quiet night, watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement. Thank you, Stanley. Justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone is brave enough to turn on the light in the dark. 8 months after the humid, violent night on the Pacific Coast Highway, the heavy oak doors of the federal district courthouse swung open to admit the public. The media circus that had begun on the steps of the 43rd Precinct had only magnified, mutating into a national spectacle. The courtroom itself was a cavernous, intimidating space of polished mahogany, towering marble columns, and severe, echoing acoustics designed to make ordinary mortals feel incredibly small beneath the weight of federal law. Every single gallery seat was occupied. Reporters, civil rights leaders, and citizens packed the wooden benches, their collective breath bated as the climax of the century's most explosive police brutality trial finally commenced. At the plaintiff's table sat Oliver Lewis. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that accommodated his massive, muscular frame, his posture as rigidly disciplined as it had been on the asphalt months ago. The bruising on his face had long since healed, but the invisible scars of betrayal by his own countrymen remained. Beside him sat Scarlett Hayes, radiating an aura of lethal, controlled confidence. Today, she wore a striking, immaculate white blazer over a black dress, a visual representation of the stark, undeniable truth she was about to present. Across the aisle, seated at the defense table, was former Officer Tiffany Vance. The transformation was startling. Stripped of her taxpayer-funded uniform, her badge, and her unearned authority, she looked entirely diminished. Her skin was pale and sallow, her blonde hair hung limp and unstyled, and her shoulders were permanently hunched in a defensive crouch. The formidable predator who had barked orders and wielded 50,000 volts of electricity was gone, replaced by a terrified, deeply broken woman facing the absolute ruin of her life. Her court-appointed attorney, a weary public defender drowning in the indefensible reality of his client's actions, sat beside her, nervously organizing useless legal pads. The trial was a dual-pronged nightmare for Tiffany, a federal civil rights lawsuit for $50 million running adjacent to her impending criminal sentencing. Scarlett had been granted wide latitude by the presiding judge to cross-examine Tiffany, a legal maneuver that promised to be nothing short of a public execution of Tiffany's character. The plaintiff calls Tiffany Vance to the stand, Scarlett announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling like a gavel strike. Tiffany stood on trembling legs, walking to the witness box as if marching to the gallows. She swore to tell the truth, her voice barely a frightened whisper. Scarlett did not approach the podium immediately. She paced slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with every single juror. Then, she turned her predatory gaze on Tiffany. Miss Vance. In your initial, sworn police report, the one you filed hours after paralyzing my client with a taser, you stated that you feared for your life because Chief Lewis made a sudden, erratic lunge toward his center console. Is that correct? Yes, Tiffany croaked, gripping the edges of the witness stand until her knuckles turned bone white. I thought he had a gun. You thought he had a gun, Scarlett repeated, letting the absurdity of the statement hang in the quiet room. Let's look at the tape, shall we? Scarlett gestured to the massive, high-definition monitor erected in the center of the courtroom. The room plunged into darkness, and the viral footage recorded by Stanley, who sat proudly in the front row of the gallery, began to play. The audio filled the room. Oliver's calm, deep voice politely asking permission to move his hand. The agonizingly slow, completely transparent movement of his arm. And then, Tiffany's unhinged, screeching panic. Scarlett froze the frame at the exact millisecond before Tiffany deployed her weapon. Miss Vance, point to the erratic lunge. Point to the exact moment this decorated military veteran, whose hands are clearly visible and open, threatened your life. Tiffany stared at the screen, a tear leaking from her eye. It happened fast in the moment. You weren't there. You don't know the stress of the uniform. I know the stress of perjury. Miss Vance, Scarlett snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. I know that your partner, Officer Frank, sat in this very chair yesterday and testified under oath that there was zero threat. He testified that you escalated the situation maliciously. He testified that you acted not out of fear, but out of hate. Scarlett took a step closer, towering over the witness box. Let's move forward in the video. The tape played again, the sickening thud of Oliver hitting the truck, the brutal deployment of the taser, and then the ultimate, damning climax. Oliver's military identification sliding across the pavement, coming to rest at Tiffany's boots. The camera captured her looking down, her face twisting into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust, before she deliberately kicked the ID into the storm drain. Tell the jury, Miss Vance, Scarlett commanded, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. When you looked down and saw the United States Navy crest, when you realized you had just violently assaulted a chief petty officer, what exactly were you afraid of then? Were you afraid of his service record? Or did you kick his ID into the sewer because, in your eyes, no amount of military service, no amount of honor, and no amount of compliance could ever make a black man worthy of your respect? The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was irreversible. Tiffany buried her face in her hands, openly sobbing into the microphone. She had no defense. The blue wall was dead. The truth had cornered her, and there was nowhere left to hide. The jury deliberation was stunningly, almost insultingly brief. In complex federal civil rights cases, juries could sometimes deliberate for days or even weeks, agonizing over the nuances of qualified immunity and proportional force. But the jury for Oliver Lewis v. Sex, the city and Tiffany Vance returned to the courtroom in less than 3 hours. Their speed was a terrifying testament to the absolute indefensibility of the defendant's actions. As the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box, the heavy atmosphere in the courtroom turned electric. Tiffany Vance looked physically ill, her skin a translucent gray, her eyes darting frantically around the room, as if searching for a magical escape hatch that didn't exist. Her attorney didn't even bother to offer a comforting hand. He simply stared down at his legal pad, accepting the inevitable defeat. Across the aisle, Oliver Lewis remained a statue of composure. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the mahogany table, his face a portrait of quiet dignity. Behind him in the gallery, Stanley leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment his bravery had purchased. Has the jury reached a verdict? The presiding judge asked, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension. We have, Your Honor, the foreperson, a middle-aged school teacher, replied, handing a sealed envelope to the bailiff. The bailiff walked the envelope to the judge, who opened it, scanned the contents with an unreadable expression, and handed it back to the clerk to read into the official record. In the matter of the federal civil rights lawsuit, the clerk began, her voice ringing clear and loud. On the count of excessive use of force under the color of law, we find the defendant, Tiffany Vance, entirely liable. On the count of malicious prosecution and falsification of official records, we find the defendant liable. Furthermore, we find the 43rd Precinct and the city to have exhibited gross negligence in their failure to discipline and properly train their officers. Tiffany let out a low, whimpering gasp, the sound of a woman watching her life evaporate. Regarding compensatory and punitive damages, the clerk continued, the entire room holding its collective breath. We award the plaintiff, Chief Petty Officer Oliver Lewis, the sum of $52 million to be paid jointly by the city and the defendant. A shockwave ripped through the gallery. It was one of the largest settlements in the state's history, but the hammer had not finished falling. The judge raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. The civil matter is concluded. Now, moving to the parallel criminal sentencing phase. Miss Vance, please stand. Tiffany stood, her knees visibly knocking together. Tiffany Vance, the judge said, his tone devoid of any judicial mercy. You were entrusted with a badge, a weapon, and the immense power to strip citizens of their liberty. You took that sacred trust and weaponized it through the lens of your own prejudice. You tortured a compliant military veteran. You lied on federal documents. You attempted to destroy a man's life to feed your own ego. Society cannot tolerate an enforcer of the law who fundamentally despises the people she is sworn to protect. The judge paused, looking down at her from his elevated bench. On the federal criminal charges of deprivation of rights under the color of law and aggravated assault, I sentence you to 180 months 15 years in a maximum security federal correctional facility, without the possibility of early parole. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. The gavel fell with a final, deafening crack. Two enormous U.S. Marshals immediately flanked Tiffany. They grabbed her arms, pulling them firmly behind her back, and the harsh, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet courtroom felt like the ultimate poetry of justice. Tiffany wept openly, her legs giving out, forcing the marshals to practically drag her out the side door. The fallout did not stop there. Within an hour of the verdict, Police Chief Rebecca Thorne, who had desperately tried to sweep the incident under the rug, was publicly fired by a panicked city council. Stripped of her golden pension and facing her own impending perjury investigation, Rebecca left police headquarters out the back door, hiding her face under a coat, her legacy permanently destroyed. The corrupt kingdom had been burned to the ground. 2 years passed, the relentless march of time cementing the consequences of that fateful night on the highway. For former Officer Tiffany Vance, time was measured not in days, but in the agonizing, endless stretch of concrete and steel. She was housed in the Federal Correctional Institution at Aliceville. Because of her highly publicized background as a vicious, corrupt police officer, she was completely despised by the general inmate population. For her own physical safety, the warden had placed her in a protective housing unit, a polite term for 23 hours a day of brutal, crushing solitary confinement. Her cell was a bleak, monochromatic nightmare, a steel toilet, a thin, painfully hard mattress, and a single, narrow slit of a window that offered a mocking glimpse of a sky she could no longer touch. She wore a drab, oversized khaki jumpsuit, a harsh contrast to the crisp, authoritative blue uniform she had once used to terrorize others. The absolute isolation had taken a severe toll on her mind. There was no one to bark orders at. There was no gun to hide behind. There was only the deafening silence of her cell and the relentless, haunting memory of Oliver Lewis's calm, stoic face staring back at her in the darkness. She had thrown away her freedom, her career, and her humanity for a fleeting moment of hateful power. Karma had not just found her, it had swallowed her whole. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, the sun shone brilliantly over the sprawling, vibrant green quad of the State University. The air was filled with the joyous, cacophonous sounds of a marching band, cheering families, and the rustle of black graduation gowns. Stanley stood near the grandstand, adjusting his mortarboard, a massive, brilliant smile lighting up his face. Today, he wasn't just the terrified kid hiding in a battered Honda Civic. He was graduating at the top of his class with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. "You look sharp, Stanley," a deep, familiar baritone voice rumbled behind him. Stanley turned to see Oliver Lewis stepping through the crowd. Oliver looked magnificent. He was dressed in his immaculate Navy service dress whites, the chest of his uniform heavy with medals of valor. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent souvenir from a recent deployment, entirely unrelated to the taser, but his posture was as towering and indomitable as ever. He had used a portion of his massive settlement to fund a foundation dedicated to providing legal defense and scholarships for minority youths facing systemic injustice, and Stanley was the foundation's very first success story. True to his word, Oliver's security brothers had watched over Stanley for the last 2 years, ensuring his safety through the worst of the media storm. Oliver extended a large, calloused hand, and Stanley took it, pulling the massive soldier into a tight brotherly hug. "I couldn't have made it to this stage without you, Oliver," Stanley said, his voice thick with emotion. "You protected me." "You protected me first, son," Oliver replied, his dark eyes shining with profound pride. He reached into his immaculate white jacket and pulled out a small, beautifully polished wooden box, handing it to the young nurse. Stanley opened it. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was a premium, engraved stethoscope. The engraving caught the bright afternoon sunlight. It read, "To Stanley, courage cures the deepest wounds. Chief O. Lewis." Stanley looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. He looked at the decorated warrior standing before him, a man who had faced the darkest, most corrupt ugliness of society and emerged not with bitterness, but with an unyielding grace. The viral video had exposed a monster, but it had also forged an unbreakable brotherhood between a soldier and a healer. The nightmare was finally over. The shadows of the 43rd Precinct had been utterly vanquished by the light, and as Stanley walked across the stage to accept his diploma to the deafening cheers of Oliver and the crowd, he knew that true justice, though hard-fought, was the most beautiful victory of all. Even in the darkest moments, a single spark of courage can illuminate the path to healing. This story is a beautiful reminder that from the ashes of cruelty, a profound, lifelong brotherhood can bloom. Oliver and Stanley proved that true strength lies not in the power to harm, but in the gentle courage to protect one another. Together, a resilient soldier and a brave student turned a night of fear into a radiant legacy of hope, showing us the magic of looking out for our neighbors. If this heartwarming journey of unexpected friendship and the unbreakable human spirit touched your soul, please hit that like button, share this story with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting tales of hope and triumph.